Hello and welcome back to the Introduction to R for Geospatial Data videos. This episode will work on exploring data frames. In this episode, we'll answer the question of how can we manipulate a data frame. And we'll learn how to add rows and columns to a data frame and append two data frames together. In addition, we'll also look at some of the basic qualities of a data frame, including the size and shape, the columns, and the first few rows. And so we'll learn how to display those as well. The first thing we need to do when we get back to working on any project is to open the R project for our project. Right now you can see we're in a blank R Studio with no R project selected. To get to the particular R project that we set up in the previous episodes, we can open it in the upper right-hand corner. There's this little R cube and it says project next to it, and right now it says none, but we can open R's by clicking the drop down menu here and then choosing the R Geospatial project, and you'll see it switches to the R Geospatial project and picks up where we left off. Right now it's asking me to update, and I'm going to have it ask me about that later. And right now then we have our script up from the last episode, and we can see in the file pane window here we're in our R project folder that we set up in the earlier episodes of this video series. And so there are other ways you can open the R project. You can actually click on this rproj file from the Finder or File Explorer window. In the next episode, we'll explore how to open our R project using that pathway instead. All right, so anytime we're creating a new script, we can click this New File button in the upper right-hand corner of RStudio, and then we want to choose our script. And here you can see it still has my previous script up, but now I have a new script here. Let's add some information. Let's see what we added. Information we added at the top of the last one. We said the date and a little bit of information about it. And so let's continue. We'll add a few different notes here. We'll say we're working on Geospatial workshop, and then we're going to say we're working on the Intro R lesson, and here we'll put that we are exploring data frames. This gives us some notes at the beginning of our particular script. Other information you might want to include are the date, your name, and how to contact you. So if someone else finds that script later, they can contact you with questions. All right, let's save this script. So I'll press the save icon here. I could also press Command S and it would pop this up, or Control S if you're on a Windows machine. All right, and in my scripts folder, so I want to click on my scripts folder, I'm going to save this second script. So I can keep numbering them in order of the numbers. So this is the second script I've created. I might start it with 02 instead. I'm going to start numbering them here for the episode. So this is episode 4 of the lesson. So I'm going to put 04 dash, and then I'm going to say exploring, let's just call this one data frames. And if we don't put an R here, it'll automatically add that R at the end to tell us that this is an R script. And so I'll go ahead and click save. And now we have our script with a saved name. All right, so we're going to be working with the data, a data frame. And in doing so, we need to actually import a data frame into our environment. And so we can do so. This time we're going to work with the Gapminder data set, and we'll take a look at what's included in that Gapminder data set as we explore it. And so first we're going to make an object in R called Gapminder. And we're going to use our assignment operator to assign a value to that Gapminder object. And we're going to use the function read.csv, which lets us read CSV files into our environment here. And so in our Gapminder is one of the data files that we saved under the data folder. So if we click data here, we can see we have this Gapminder underscore data, and it's actually called .text, but it is a CSV file. For our purposes, we'll leave it as is, but it's definitely a CSV file. Okay, so let's go back to our geospatial folder here. And then in our read CSV, we're going to do open parentheses and then open quotation marks. And then we'll go ahead and type data. So we tell it it's in the data folder from our current project. And then it's called Gapminder, and I can start to type it. But if I don't remember the full name of it, or I'm afraid I'm going to make a typo, I can press the tab key here. And since it's unique at that level, Gapminder is only one, what I had typed so far only matched one file in the data folder. It filled in the rest of the information for me when I pressed tab there. So that can be really useful. That's called tab complete. All right, so to read in our data with the following code, we're going to go ahead and press Control or Command Return to run the first line of our script here. And then you can see in my environment pane here, I now have an object called Gapminder. It has 1,704 observations of 6 variables. So the first thing we're going to look at is a little bit more information about that Gapminder data set. And so we're going to run a function called structure, which is str for short, that'll tell us the structure of our Gapminder data frame that we just imported into R, we just read into R. And so we'll say structure of Gapminder, str Gapminder, and we'll run that. And you can see here below it prints that it's a data frame. So that's the data structure, tells us how many observations and variables that we have in this data frame, similar to how we can see it in our environment pane here. And then it shows us each of the columns that are in that data frame. So there's country, year, the population, the continent, the life expectancy, and the GDP per cap are all the columns that we have. And then it also tells us a little bit more. It tells us the type of each of those objects. Here it shows us this one's a character, these are integers, that's number, this one's also a character, and these two are numbers or numeric types. And then it starts to show us a little bit of each of those columns, so it shows us the first few values of each of those columns as well. Another way we can see this structure is actually in our environment pane here. If we click this little play button next to Gapminder, it actually controls a drop-down menu that shows us the same information as we see when we look at structure. The only thing that's missing is it doesn't show us the type of data structure we have, or we can see that with data frame here. We can go ahead and collapse that again so we don't have to see the structure. We can also explore our data using some of the previous commands that we learned, such as class. So let's say we wanted to look specifically at the type of the year. So we could say the class of Gapminder $year and run that. And it tells us that it's an integer, as we also could see here in our numeric. We could do the same for some of the other columns and print them out as well. Another common thing we might want to look at, it's also included in structure, but sometimes we specifically need to grab the information about the length of the data frame, so how many rows are in that particular data frame. And so sometimes we need that for other parts of our code that are dependent on the length. And so we actually have a specific command that will tell us the length that's called length. So if we say length of Gapminder and press enter, it'll tell us, that is actually giving us the number of columns. I think I must have misinterpreted that. I thought it was going to give us the rows, but it looks like it gives us the number of columns. And so when we need that information about the number of columns, we can use the length function. If we needed the information about how many rows we have in this, instead we can use a function called nRow. Gapminder, it's a number of rows. And we can run that. And here it gives us back the number of rows. That shows us we have 1,700 rows and 1,704 rows. There is a corresponding same function called ncol for the number of columns and the Gapminder. So if we wanted to be more explicit, we can use this ncol. But length will tell us the number of columns as well. If we wanted to see both of these values, the number of rows and the number of columns at once, we could use this function called dim, which stands for dimensions. So it's a Gapminder. And we can go ahead and run that. And here it gives us back the number of rows and then also the number of columns. We may also want to see the column names, so we can type call names, which gives us all the column names, Gapminder. Oops, INDER. And then I'll go ahead and run that line. And you can see it returns back each of the column names in a vector form. So it gives us the first one, country, year, population, continent, life expectancy, and GDP per cap. And sometimes that's useful for us when we need to know what columns of data we have. Maybe it's a little bit too long to be listed here because it could have more than 6 columns, also called variables in R. In addition, we might also want to look at the first little bit of the data. So I often like to inspect what the first section of my data. And so we can use a function called head to look at the first few rows of our data. I'll say head of Gapminder. And I'll go ahead and run that. And you can see it prints back the first 6 rows by default of whatever you put in it. Head also works on vectors. So if you wanted to look at the first 6 items of a vector, you can use head on it as well. Before we move on, before we do our first challenge here, let's go back and add some comments. We've been slacking on putting our comments in, but we don't want to do that because later we won't know what all of these different functions are doing. So we'll say here we are reading in the Gapminder data. Let's see, inspecting the structure, looking at the class for a particular column, finding the length, aka number of columns, looking at the number of rows and columns, and finally we'll say looking at the column names and inspecting the first 6 rows of the Gapminder data. All right, and I've been pressing Control S and saving pretty regularly because I'm always afraid I'm going to lose information, and so I save as I go. All right, let's start our first challenge. So we just looked at the first few lines of our data. Let's also look at the last few lines of our data. So try that out, and then also try and look at some in the middle. That's a little bit of a bonus challenge. It's using something we haven't used before. Try and sample a random subset of those rows and give us some of the middle rows as well. Give that a try. Pause the video here, and unpause when you'd like to go over the answer. All right, so let's take a look at the answer to this challenge. First, let's leave ourselves a comment. So first we wanted to look at the last few lines of our data. And so the command to look at the first few lines of our data was head. The last few lines, the command is tail. So we can do that with tail of Gapminder and run it. We can also modify both head and tail to include a specific number of lines if we want to. So if we look at tail of Gapminder and we had a comma and we say we want n equals 15, so the number of rows equals 15, instead it'll give us the first 15 rows. So by default it gives us 6, but if we want more, we can ask it for more. So in this next one, we're going to be using that data frame subsetting where we use square brackets. So remember the square brackets, if we have any data frame, so let's say my data frame, and we wanted to use the square bracket, here we tell it the rows, and then here we tell it the columns. We'll cover that a little bit more in the next episode as well. And so for a random sample of rows, we can say Gapminder, square bracket, and then we'll use this sample function that gives us random numbers. And so then we'll say n row Gapminder, so that's the number of rows in Gapminder. So this is the first argument to sample is how many rows or what numbers to sample from. So from 1 or I think, yeah, from 1 to how many rows, and then how many items we want it to give us. So we want to give it 5, and we don't want it to be greater than the number of rows. So the first thing we're telling it is how many rows we have, how many numbers to choose from, or what's the max number to choose from. And the second number we're giving it here is how many samples we want. We want 5. And then we'll say comma. And so this is for rows. So it's going to give us back a random subset of 5 numbers. And that's going to be the rows that it selects. And then we want all of the columns. So we'll leave this side blank here. All right, I got a typo in here. So I messed up Gapminder. MINDER. Go ahead and run that again. And again, the error that we just saw was because I typed Gapminder wrong, and so it was looking for one with the misspelled name, and it didn't find it in the environment. All right, so when we run our code here, it'll give us a random sampling of rows, so we can kind of check some of the middle rows out as well. And your numbers will likely be different than mine because sample picked random numbers for you, and they're going to be different random numbers than it gave me. All right, next we're going to learn how to add rows and columns to our data frames. Sometimes you will be manually adding rows and columns to your data frame. More likely you're going to be using whatever data entry method and you used and then importing all of your data at once. But in case you need to edit your data, you want to be able to add rows and columns to your data frame. All right, so first we'll see how to add a column to our data frame. So first we're going to create a vector because all of the columns in our data frame are actually vectors underlying that structure. And so we're going to create the below average column, below underscore average, and to it we're going to assign all of this. To this column we're going to assign whether the life expectancy is above or below the average life expectancy, which is 70.5. And so let's say Gapminder $life exp for the life expectancy column. And we want to say where it's greater than, or life expectancy is less than 70.5. And so here what it's going to return is true when that row was less than 70, and it's going to return false if it's greater than 70. And so we should have a vector of those statements when we run this. So if we run it, you can see below average is a logical vector, and it has the same number of items as our number of rows in our original data set here. And then for any of them that were below average, it says true, and any of the ones that were above average, it says false. And so now we have this column of data that we want to add on to our data frame. And so to add it onto our data frame, let's take a look. Just before we add it on, let's look at our data again. So we'll say head Gapminder to see that it doesn't have that new data frame, that new data on it yet. And then we'll use a function called cbind, which stands for column bind. And we'll add Gapminder, and we want to put onto Gapminder below average. So we're going to add this below average column onto our Gapminder data frame. And let's go ahead and run that line. And the output's kind of long because again, we're outputting all of our data, but if we take a look at it, now we have, scroll back up here. Now we have a new column on our data frame that has the below average, and it says true if life expectancy was below the average. So you can see here it was 28, and so that's below the 70.5 average we saw. And then down below we can find some that are false, where it's above the average. You'll want to note that we didn't actually change our data frame here. So our Gapminder data here still has 6 variables. It still only has the 6 columns, but we printed it out. If we wanted to actually save Gapminder with the new below average column on it, we would need to use our assignment arrow and assign it back to an object, either overwriting the existing Gapminder data frame or creating a new object that has the original Gapminder data with the new below average column on it. Since ours is really long, we could also have done head, cbind, Gapminder, comma, below average. Maybe we'll continue to do this as we go on to show us only the first 6 rows. All right, let's see what happens if our below average vector is not the same length as our Gapminder data frame was. So not the same number of rows, right? When we created our our below average column here, we had one item in the vector for each row. So it was 1,704 rows long. Let's create a below average vector that's shorter. So we'll say below average and our assignment arrow here, and we'll use C to create a vector by hand. And we're going to make this still those vectors of trues and falses. So we're going to say true, 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 and true. So we're going to write true 5 times. We have 5 trues in our vectors, and that's far short of our 1,700 observations. So we'll go ahead and run below average. You can see it overwrote the old below average, and now it has 5 items in it. Okay, so let's try again that head cbind, Gapminder, and below average. And so again, we're going to combine those 2 columns. We're going to column bind, and we're only going to look at the first 6 rows of our result. But we don't actually get a result with this one. Instead, it gives us an error. It says differing number of rows. There are 1,700 rows and in the data frame, and there are only 5 in our below average vector. And so it will give us this error if they don't match up. However, there is a little bit of a trick around this, is if we have a below average vector that is a multiple, that the number of it is a multiple of the, or rather if the Gapminder data set is a multiple of the below average size, then it will actually do that and repeat the same pattern from the below average vector over and over again. So let's give that a try. Let's give this some new lines so we can try it out. All right, so here we're going to make below average again, our assignment arrow, and then we're going to use C. And this time we're going to say 3, so that it's 3 times a number gets you 1,704. And so we're going to say true, true, false. And we'll go ahead and run below average again. And now we can see it only has 3 items. And again, we'll say head, cbind, Gapminder, and below average. If we run this time it didn't give us an error, which is unexpected. Oftentimes we aren't going to want this to actually be able to combine those onto a new column. And so you can see instead it's repeating that pattern that I gave it over and over again, true, true, false, true, true, false, which could be useful for us in some circumstances. In the below average column, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for it to be a pattern and not an actual relationship to the life expectancy column. And so that's not what we would want to happen. But so watch out to make sure that the things that you're trying to put on in the column are the same size and have the same number of rows in it. Because sometimes it will actually append even when you don't want it to. It will combine on, let you cbind. All right, let's put our below average column back on. And let's create the one that actually has the life expectancy. So we're going to say below average. And we're going to be certain that it lets us, it's actually a logical value. So we'll say as logical. And then we're going to say Gapminder, $life, exp is less than 70.5. So we created our new below average column again. This one, as we can see, actually has the right number of observations. And this time let's cbind Gapminder and below average. But let's save this back to a data frame. So we want to actually add the columns so that we can continue to use it as we go forward. Before, as I mentioned before, it's printing out as we run this cbind. It prints out the result, but it doesn't save it. And so if we want to be able to use the data frame that has this below average column on it in the future, we need to save it to an object. And so we need to assign it to an object using the assignment arrow. So we'll go back to the beginning of our line and add that assignment arrow. And then we also need to give it an object to assign it to. We could make a second copy that has the below average column on it. Since this doesn't really manipulate the data in a way that messes up, like our original data is still there, I'm going to overwrite it. I'm going to say Gapminder, and I'm going to assign it back to that same Gapminder object. And so as I run this line, you should notice that it's going to change from 6 variables here to 7. So if I go ahead and run it, didn't print anything out, but it does change the number of variables. So now if we run head of Gapminder, again, we can see now we have the below average column and we can use it in future analyses. So here we added a column onto our data. Now let's see what happens. How can we add a row? So let's say we want to add a row onto our data. So here we can create our new row. Just as we made a vector for the new column, we're going to create a new row, and this time we're going to make it a list structure. This list structure allows us to have items that are not the same type in them. So in a data frame, all of the columns are the same type. They're all vectors, which require that they be the same type. So a vector always has to have the same type in it, as we talked about in the section on coercion before. But the rows don't have the same types. And so if we want to create a group of items that doesn't have the same type to it, we can use a list instead. And so our row will have different types for the different items. And so the first thing we need is a country. And so we'll, in quotation marks here, put Norway. And then the second thing we need is a year. So we'll say 2016. And then the next thing we need is a population value. Not sure this is the actual population value, but we'll imagine it is. We'll say it's 5 million, so 5 and 6 zeros. 6 zeros there. And then we need a continent, and we're going to call this the Nordic continent, which isn't really a continent, but we'll use it as our continent here. And then we want to add in the life expectancy value. So that's going to be, we'll say 80.3. And then we need to add in a GDP per capita. And so we're going to create a false value there, which is 49400.0. So that one's a floating point value. So it's a decimal here. So we can have a decimal. Both actually life expectancy and GDP per cap are decimals, and they're numeric types in our data frame. And then here, the last column we have is that below average column, and we're going to write false there. And so we've created this row of items to add to our data frame that has all of the different column values in it for our row. We'll go ahead and run it. And you can see in my environment now I have my new row, and it says it's a list of 7 items. It's good we know that our number of columns matches our number of variables, so that when we bind it on, it will match up as we expect. So this one is a false row, and it's going to change our data in a way. So we're going to actually create a new Gapminder _ Norway. So it has the Norway on it. We're going to create a new object and assign it to that. And like we used cbind to bind a new column on, we're going to use rbind to add a new row on. And so we're going to say we want to add rbind onto our Gapminder data frame, and we want to add the new row list. So go ahead and run that. We can't see it right now, but if we use that tail command we learned earlier, tail function here, we can say Gapminder _ Norway and look at the tail. And so here we can see that new row that we added onto the data frame. In addition to adding rows and columns on our data frame, we might want to add on a data frame to a data frame. So sometimes we'll have two data frames that actually have the same columns and we want to append them onto one another. So this is kind of stacking the two data frames on top of one another, and they should have all the same columns then already. And so let's go ahead and create a new version. Let's call this Gapminder 2 because we're going to have two copies of the Gapminder data set in it. And so to do that, we can actually do a similar row bind, R bind, because we are putting it on the end. We're stacking them on top of each other. There are sets of rows, and we're going to row bind them again. So we're going to say R bind, B-I-N-D, and then we want to put the Gapminder data frame, and the second thing we'll put here is the Gapminder data frame. Unlikely you're going to have two data frames that you actually want to repeat the data in, but if you did, you could do this. More likely you're going to have, let's say, your original Gapminder data set and then the latest year you want to bind on. So you have a data frame with the latest year and you want to bind that onto the full data set. All right, we'll go ahead and run this Gapminder 2. And let's take a look. Let's use tail again to look at the end of our Gapminder 2 data frame. Let's look at the last 3 rows specifically so we can practice using our n argument for the tail, which works similarly as the n argument for head and specifies that we want 3 instead of 6. And so now we're looking at the last 6 of our data frame here. Let's do our next challenge. So for this challenge, you're going to use the data frame function to create a data frame from scratch and assign it to an object called df. In it, you're going to have a column that's ID that starts ABC, a column called X that's 1, 2, 3 so far, and then a column that's Y that's true, true, false. And then to that data frame, go ahead and add a new row that has a D, a 4, and a true in it. And so go ahead and add that. And then once you've done that, do that again, creating a new data frame that has E and F in it, and the corresponding 5 and 6, and false and false in it. So you're going to create a second data frame, and then bind that data frame onto your original DF data frame. The first bind you're going to do is a single row, and then you're going to do actually 2 rows at once using the data frame structure you created again. Pause here to give this challenge a try, and unpause when you'd like to see the answer. Let's take a look at this challenge together. Let's create some blank lines here. And so first we need to create our data frame called df. We're going to use that data frame function. And we said it needed to have a column called ID, which has C, A, B, and C. So we were given this information. And then we needed a second column called X that is from 1 to 3. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3 in the X column. And then in the Y column, we're going to have a C, and we're going to say true, true, and false are the Y column. So let's go ahead and run that and create a new data frame. So we can see our DF function, our data frame here. Let's look at the head of DF. It only has 3 rows, so it prints them out, but we can see it has IDs A, B, C, X is 1, 2, 3, and Y is true, true, false. All right, so first we said we wanted to add a single row to it that has D in it. And so remember, to add a row, we need to use a list structure. So we'll call this row D. And we'll say we want a list, and we need the 3 items that are going to be part of the list. So it's going to be, the first item is going to be a D. The second item is going to be a 4. And the third item is going to be a true. So we'll go ahead and run that. So now we have our row D, and then we'll use R bind to bind, and we need to add it onto DF, and then we want to add on row D. If I run that, I can take a look at it. Yep, and so now I have row D, but I didn't save it, so I don't have row D if I run DF right now. So if I do head of DF, can see it doesn't actually have row D. And so if I want to keep row D, I need to take this row bind, and I'm going to actually copy it here, and I'm going to reassign it to DF. So we're going to overwrite DF to have row D from now on. So now if we run head DF, we can see now we have row D. And so we're going to do the same thing for E and F. We're going to add an E and F column, but first for this one, instead, we're going to make it as a data frame. And so we're going to call this DF EF, so data frame for the E and F rows. And so we're going to say data.frame, open parentheses, ID equals C. And so here we're going to need an E and an F. And then we need to match our column. So the other column is an X. And so in this column, we're going to have from 5 to 6. And then for Y, we're going to say C, and then we're going to say false. Oops, except it's not a string false, it's a logical false, so it doesn't need quotation marks around it. And then false. All right, so let's make this data frame EF. So let's look at it, head EF. Oops, it's called DF EF. And so now we have our data frame that has 2 rows in it, and we want to bind it onto our original DF, so we can use R bind again to bind on to our data frame. We want to bind on data frame underscore EF. And I think I won't save this one. I'll just print it out by running this line. Now I have this data frame that has all of the rows on it that I wanted, and it binds the last 2. This one, again, I didn't save the version of it that has the E and F rows bound on. I printed it out, but I didn't assign it to anything. And so if I moved forward, I wouldn't be able to use those. I wouldn't be able to use those rows because I didn't save them to any object. They are actually in the data frame EF as well, but they're not in my DF data frame. So in this lesson, we learned how to use cbind and rbind to add new columns and rows to data frames. And we also learned a little bit about how to inspect the data at the very beginning. So we inspected our data, took a look at the different data structures as we imported them. This is the end of the data structures episode. Please see the next episode to learn more about the fundamentals of R for working with geospatial data.